Welcome, everyone. It's your host, Danny Dhaiphong. Thanks for coming to another live stream. As you can see here, I am joined by friend of the show, guest Scott Ritter, former UN weapons inspector and U.S. Marine Corps intelligence officer, now journalist, author, geopolitical analyst, and so much more. Scott, we weren't supposed to be speaking today or from this part of the world anytime soon, but here we are. Thanks for coming back on.
Well, thanks for having me.
Well, let's begin with you were about to depart to Russia. We spoke about the trip on this show. You had everything set up. You're about to board a plane to Turkey in the first week of June, but you were unable to go. Your passport was seized by the State Department. Could you talk about, one, what has happened since then, and two, you have been talking a lot about this suppression, this act, this heinous violation of your rights as something bigger than just yourself. So also, if you could speak to that as well.
Well, first of all, let's just point out that my passport wasn't seized by the State Department. It was seized by armed members of the Customs and Border Protection Service, 3 of them to be precise, who pulled me out of the line right before I was boarding the aircraft. They took control of the passport and said that they did so on the authority of the United States State Department, on the orders of the United States State Department. They didn't show me those orders. They didn't tell me what the authority was. They couldn't even tell me who in the State Department to call to get clarification. They just took the passport. And since then, there's been no update. I've reached out to the U.S. government, to the State Department, and even when I get human beings, they immediately shut up and the best they could do is give me an address to write a letter. And so that's where we're at. But, this isn't rocket science. I was issued this passport in 2021. And I have traveled extensively with this passport, including 2 prior trips to Russia. The Customs and Border Patrol showed great interest upon my return both times, taking control of my passport and asking me numerous questions. The U.S. government was informed in advance of my travel plans for prior trips and this one. What made this different is that this time I was going to speak to the St. Petersburg International Economic Forum, the largest forum of its type in the world, the most important forum of its type in the world. And then I was scheduled in August to speak at the Moscow International Security Conference, which again is probably the preeminent security conference in the world right now, given the current geopolitical situation. And in the interim, I was going to carry out a 40-day tour of Russia, one of the goals of which was to make a documentary film that would capture the essence of Russia, bring it back, and show to an American audience. And I think I hit the trifecta of fear on the part of the State Department, who shut it down. And that's what happened. The State Department made a deliberate decision to shut this trip down, to make sure it didn't happen. And it's an infringement on First Amendment rights. Whatever excuse the State Department comes up with, we know what it is. There's not an outstanding warrant for my arrest. If there was, I wouldn't be here. You don't seize the passport and then say, go. You say you're under arrest. That's what due process is all about. I'm not in arrears on my taxes. That's another reason. I don't owe child support or I don't have alimony payments. There's nothing of that nature. So the State Department made a decision in the past to let me travel. It was a concerted decision on their part. They said, yes, he can travel. This time they said, no, he cannot travel. Why? They didn't want me to speak. That's sort of an infringement on freedom of association. That's an infringement on Fifth Amendment rights of freedom of travel. That's an infringement on freedom of speech. The State Department apparently, doesn't understand what the Constitution is. They may come up with some hocus pocus, gobbledygook. But the bottom line is I was traveling on a valid passport issued to me by the State Department in 2021, a valid passport that the State Department allowed me to travel several times in the past 2 years, including 2 trips to Russia. And now the State Department decided you're not going to travel. It was specifically to stop me from attending these conferences and carrying out this filming. And there's no other way to spin this, none whatsoever.
Well, you must be doing something right, Scott. What exactly do you believe they're so afraid of? I mean, you were going to go travel around Russia. You had a lot of goals for this trip, including the St. Petersburg International Economic Forum. So I'm wondering your assessment on what is the quote unquote threat, do you think, for allowing you in particular to speak? Because you are one of the few people in the United States who was going to make this kind of trip. If anyone else is doing this, the project itself is unique unto your efforts.
I can't speak on behalf of the State Department, and it's really a struggle to get into their mindset. I know that they do not want to have anybody come up with the antidote to the poison of Russophobia that the State Department's been spreading throughout the United States and in Western Europe. And again, this is what I do. This is what I'm about. I'm about creating the antidote to Russophobia. And I do that by traveling to Russia, by speaking to Russians, by gathering information that the United States government doesn't want gathered and which the mainstream media won't gather. I assess it fairly, without bias, and then I regurgitate it back into the United States and to be consumed by the American audience. And I think, I don't want to toot my own horn because it's really not about that, but for better or for worse, depending on your point of view, my message has been gaining traction, both in the United States and abroad. When I started this project back in 2023, when I traveled, or let's say the summer of 2022, I think I had 17,000 Twitter followers. And today the number is up over 353,000. That's just an indication of the scale of expansion of attention that's being paid to my efforts and the efforts of those people who helped me. And so we're in the process of gaining critical mass at an important juncture. I mean, this summer is going to be a critical summer for the United States because of upcoming elections. And the last thing, a politicized State Department, and that's what we're dealing with here. We're not dealing with a State Department that represents the United States of America or the American people. We're dealing with a State Department that operates solely at the behest of the executive branch to carry out the political objectives of the President of the United States, in this case, Joe Biden, who, by the way, is my mortal enemy. And so I think the State Department understood that, and the White House understood that this effort that I was undertaking was gaining traction and had the potential of becoming a political problem for the Biden administration in the summer of 2024. So they shut it down. But you want to know what the irony is of all this? There's that old saying, there's no such thing as bad PR. Well, if they wanted to stifle this, if they wanted to stifle me, if they wanted, it backfired. Look, let's be frank. The State Department wanted to embarrass me. That's the whole purpose of this. There's one reason and one reason only they can take away my passport. They haven't articulated it, but I know what it is, and everybody knows what it is. I'm a registered sex offender. Now, I reject that title. I've made it clear I'm an innocent man, but it doesn't matter. The government has put that title on me, and the purpose of that is to make me embarrassed to appear in public, to make me hide in shame. It didn't work. Why? Because I ain't guilty. Why am I going to hide from anything? I'm going to hide from nothing. And for those people out there saying, you're guilty twice, I don't care about you. You don't matter. Get out of the way. I'm going to continue doing what I do for those people who care about the substance of what I have to say. What the State Department did is pull a passport that didn't have the International Megan's Law travel stamp in it. Now, remember, I didn't avoid anything. They gave me the damn passport in 2021. I was released from prison in 2015. They returned my passport in or 2014. Returned my passport in 2015. I submitted it for renewal. They knew who I was. They didn't put the stamp in it. They let me travel. They knew all this because, like I said, under the law, 21 days in advance of any international travel, I have to provide a complete itinerary, where I'm going, who I'm meeting, where I'm staying, the whole thing. It's all laid out. There's no secrets here. They got it all. And yet they let me travel in the past. And on there, the thing clearly says, I am doing this because I am a registered sex offender. I'm required by law to do this, even though I say I'm not a registered sex offender. You say I am. Therefore, I'm obeying the law. Because if I don't, I try to travel without doing this, I go to jail for 10 years. I ain't going to jail. So I submit the paperwork. It's submitted through. Everybody knows, totally compliant. Their goal right now is to pull the passport and then put the stamp of shame inside my new passport and somehow believe that that's going to intimidate me from traveling, that somehow now I'm going to be too ashamed to travel. Stick it where the sun don't shine, State Department. You can't intimidate an innocent man. You can't shame an innocent man. You only shame yourself. I'll carry that passport. I'll travel with that passport. It bothers me. It's a stupid thing. But that's okay. When I submit my visa application to Russia, I'm honest about everything where it says, have you ever been convicted? There it is. What were you convicted of? Lay it out there. The Russians know in advance. I'm not hiding anything from anybody. But the State Department felt, this is my assessment because they won't admit this, that this time they couldn't let me travel. So they did the only thing they could do, which is this narrow thing, say, oh, we're going to revoke his passport because it doesn't have the stamp in it. They could have revoked my passport at any time. For instance, when I came back from Russia in January, they held me in a cell holding area for an hour with my passport. They knew who I was. They knew what the passport was. They knew what was in the passport and what wasn't in the passport. They returned it to me. If they were concerned at that time, they should have revoked it right there and said, oh my God, you don't have the stamp of shame. We're revoking your passport. Why didn't they? Because I get a new passport, which I'm going to do. They did this at the point of maximum impact. They know how much money was spent on tickets. They know by pulling me off that airplane, there's going to be no refunding of those tickets. And they know that I had a team waiting in the wings to fly to Russia, and that we ended up, losing tens of thousands of dollars of money that we had raised for this trip is gone, irretrievably lost. This was a deliberate action by the State Department, timed not only to embarrass me, but to cripple the operation that I was running. Well, guess what, State Department? It ain't going to work. We're going to recover. We're going to get back up on our feet, and we're going to keep marching. And they can just, I have a very good friend who I respect a lot, a very wise man. And he sent me an email today reminding me that there's a lot of people who watch me when I appear on shows such as this or on my own podcast, and that I might want to start refraining from the kind of Marine Corps type language that I frequently use. And because I respect the guy and I respect his insights, he's 110% right. So even though I'm furious and would gladly rip the head off of people, I'm just going to calm down and just take a chill pill and roll with the punches, because that's all this is. This isn't the end of the fight. This is the end of a round. And they think they won the round. They didn't. Because there's going to be the next round. And on that one, they ain't going to land a punch. All the punches are going to be landed by me. It's a setback, but what they say, where there's lemons, make lemonade. You know what happened the other day, Danny? And I'm going to announce it here tonight on your show to help promote it and maybe get you involved in this. Because of this, Judge Napolitano was supposed to come with me to Russia. I was bringing him. And so the judge, and a wonderful man named Gerald Salante had dinner the other night at a beautiful restaurant in Goshen, New York. And there we talked about what needs to be done, what the next step needs to be. How do we get Americans off their butts and motivated? On September 28th, Gerald Salante is holding an event in Kingston, New York. And the event, which doesn't have a formal name yet, is dedicated to saving a democracy, saving America, saving the world. It's focused on nuclear disarmament, getting rid of nuclear weapons, We want to put 1 million people in Kingston that day. We want to replicate what happened at Woodstock, where so many people showed up that the thruway was shut down. So we're begging America to shut down the thruway on September 28th. It's a Saturday. It's New York now. You guys can partake. You can walk. You can park your cars, shut down the thruway, head to Kingston, New York, and participate in a gathering. I can't call it a march per se, but a gathering of Americans who are sending a signal in this election season that we don't want to die from nuclear conflict, that we want arms control, that we want to de-emphasize nuclear weapons, that we believe in peace, that we believe that Russia and America not only can be friends, but should be friends. So I'm sure Gerald will invite you, because I'm going to ask him to. And you have a wonderful following, and I'm hoping that you can implore your following, especially those people on the East Coast. But even if you're not, if you can't gather in Kingston, gather in San Francisco in support, gather in Seattle. Just get into the streets on September 28th and shut the center of your city down. Peaceful people standing there saying, we're just not going to take it anymore. We're not going to put up with it. I wouldn't be talking to you about this right now if I had traveled to Russia, and this would be a missed opportunity. But because the State Department, in their infinite wisdom, blocked me, I had a dinner. And at that dinner, we strategized. And what we came up with is the September 28th Save America rally. And it's going to be a great event. And we need as many people as possible to get involved in. All you have to do is show up in Kingston. That's it. Just show up in Kingston. And if the thruway's blocked, park your car and walk. Shut the thruway down, just like they did at Woodstock.
Yeah, definitely. Whatever I can do to support, I will do so. And I think it's a great point you make about opportunities arising when, as you said, the actions meant to silence you end up backfiring big time. And this is something that's been going on for quite a while. We know there's a longer history to this, but even since February of 2022, when the special military operation launched, we've talked about various lists. You are on many. This is one that we share on the Center for Countering Disinformation, the State Department backed think tank. And maybe you can talk about this a bit. How does this fit into this larger trend that's been going on since the jump of the special military operation launched by Russia?
Yeah, I mean, this is the disturbing thing, because when a lot of people might watch this and say, well, Scott, you've been again, I have to watch my language out of respect for my good friend and mentor. You've been irritating the U.S. government. And so, of course, there's a price you have to pay. You didn't think you were just going to be able to, kick the hornet's nest and not get stung. All right, fair enough. I'm getting stung. But this isn't about me. This is what people need to understand. If you look at this roster, what you see up there are people who aren't named Scott Ritter. These are distinguished people, including Danny. But just go around the list, and you'll see, distinguished alternative media personalities, former government officials, all serious people, all serious actors in this. And they're on this list. What is this list? This list was compiled by an entity known as the Center for Countering Disinformation. What makes this notable is that the funding to create the Center for Countering Disinformation was included in the initial new Lend-Lease Act funding back in May of 2022, funding that was voted on by the United States Congress. Now, this is an important point, because once this funding was passed, then the State Department worked with the presidency of Ukraine to create this entity, which is an adjunct of the presidency, or run out of the presidency. The State Department helped create this blacklist. The blacklist is of people who have been singled out as information terrorists by the Center for Countering Disinformation. And that's an important term, because the other thing that the Center for Countering Disinformation says is that information terrorists must be treated the same as terrorists, that they represent the same threat to the rule of law and international peace and security. And in the United States, we know that under the Obama administration, even under the Bush administration, under the Biden administration, the Trump administration, terrorists were killed without due process, including American citizens. We have assassinated American citizens in Yemen without due process because they were terrorists. And so Ukraine is saying this, but it's not Ukraine saying this in a vacuum. Ukraine is saying this in meetings organized and paid for by the United States government. In the same meeting that they promulgated this blacklist, if you look at the photographs and you read the articles, you see the State Department officials brought in from Washington, D.C. You see the embassy officials there, and they're taking notes and nodding their head as they're announcing this because they wrote the policy. The First Amendment of the United States of America says that Congress shall enact no laws that infringe on the freedom of speech or on the freedom of the press. Congress passed a law sending money to Ukraine. And inside this money package was money specifically allocated for the creation of the Center for Countering Disinformation, whose mission, as directed by the State Department of the United States, is to shut down Americans for exercising their freedom of speech. Now, did Congress pass a law deliberately to do this? No, it's an end around. But I'd sure like to have a district court somewhere in the United States take a pass at this. So if there's any constitutional lawyers out there who want to do some pro bono stuff, contact me. Contact Danny. Danny will tell you how to get in contact with me. And let's do this. I got the summer now. You know, I got things to do. I got free on my calendar. So, hey, let's declare war against the State Department and their frontal assault on free speech, because that's what this is. This Congress passed a law authorizing money to be allocated to Ukraine. Ukraine, in collusion with the United States government, the State Department, created a blacklist that includes Americans whose only crime is speaking things that the government of Ukraine doesn't like. That, to me, is a flagrant violation of the law, of the Constitution. But it's even more than that. You see, there's another list out there called the Mirotvorets list. It's a hit list, an assassination list run by the Ukrainian intelligence service. Now, I can't prove that there's American money that gets allocated to this, except to note that because it's run by the Ukrainian intelligence service, just like the State Department has a cozy relationship with the Center for Countering Disinformation, the Central Intelligence Agency has an even cozier relationship with the Ukrainian intelligence. There's nothing that the Ukrainian intelligence does that the CIA, A, doesn't know, and B, probably is directing it. We know this. We know the CIA has been working with Ukrainian intelligence since at least 2014. They've established 12 covert bases along the border between Ukraine and Russia to spy on Russia, to carry out covert actions inside Russia. And they train these operatives in, you know, they have, the CIA has an organization. It's called the Special Missions Center now. It used to be called the Special Activities Division or Special Activities Branch. But now it's the Special Missions Center. And in there, they have something called Ground Branch. Ground Branch is a paramilitary organization. And Ground Branch provides training to foreign entities in what is known as unconventional warfare. Unconventional warfare, guerrilla warfare, is assassinating people, carrying out sabotage, blowing things up, doing the dirty work. They call it unconventional warfare, but it's terrorism. Terrorism. This is why there's strong reason to believe the CIA was behind the attack on the concert hall in Moscow, because that's unconventional warfare. It's exactly designed to achieve an asymmetrical result. You attack using a small number of people and get a larger benefit from it. The CIA was probably involved in that, and there's no doubt in my mind that the CIA is at a minimum knowledgeable of and probably colluding with the Ukrainian intelligence service's effort to assassinate people. And this is a real list. It's a living list. They've assassinated Daria Dugina, for instance, the daughter of Alexander Dugin, one of the great modern philosophical, political philosophers of Russia. They assassinated Tatarsky, a Russian military blogger, killed him in St. Petersburg. They tried to kill another person in Nizhny Novgorod. They've assassinated Ukrainian politicians inside Russia. Rumor has it that during my trip to Crimea, they were trying to kill me as well. So, it's an active list, and Americans are on this list, and the Ukrainian government is targeting Americans, and the State Department does nothing. I mean, at a minimum, you should get a démarche from the State Department saying you have to shut this thing down. You're not only because you can't really be in the business of killing people who disagree with you. That's not what's done in a rules-based international order, apparently, but apparently it is. But the State Department not only has said nothing about this list, they continue to allow it to exist. And given the relationship between the CIA and Ukrainian intelligence, are probably facilitating the implementation of the assassinations that take place. So taking my passport is just the tip of the iceberg of what the State Department's doing to target Americans who dare speak out against the conflict in Ukraine. This is a frontal assault on the individual civil liberties of every American whose name is on that list. And that list is growing and growing and growing. And Congress isn't doing anything about it because Congress is in collusion with the State Department and the CIA to attack Americans. And this, again, becomes a constitutional issue. I'd love the Supreme Court to take a whack at it. So, like I said, again, any good constitutional lawyers out there want to have fun this summer? Let's rock and roll.
Well, let's maybe transition to the conflict itself. So a lot has happened as well with regard to the special military operation. In particular, there's been a lot of back and forth between NATO, or at least a lot of various leaks and reports about NATO preparing first they approved the long-range missiles and various weapons to be used on Russian soil. The United States came around to that, or at least vocally. They've been doing it since the beginning, but vocally, verbally, publicly, now it is open policy. And then there was the story of NATO preparing land corridors to rush U.S. troops from Europe to bypass any kind of logistical hurdles in an eventual war with Russia. Now, Russia has responded to all of this by stating that it is considering asymmetric warfare, backing, arming various U.S. so-called adversaries. And also, there's been a lot of talk about nuclear deterrence and about also something you've brought up many times, Scott, the possibility that Russia will strike NATO assets in NATO countries if those military assets, if that hardware is used on Russian soil to target Russian soil. Could you talk about where we are right now in this conflict? Because I think many people are looking at this and saying, wow, the escalation ladder is being climbed and it's climbing quite quickly.
Well, it is. I mean, it's a very dangerous. I personally believe that the world hasn't faced a nuclear crisis of this scope and scale since the Cold War, or even never. I'll give you an example. 1962, October 1962, the Cuban Missile Crisis. First of all, the missile crisis was slow rolling. It didn't happen instantaneously. Indeed, the big event we were worried about is as Soviet ships were heading to Cuba, there was a naval blockade put in place, and then we were watching the ships coming in to see what would happen when the two hit. And while that was happening, though, the leaders of both countries were making phone calls. They were talking to each other. Imagine that, diplomacy. There was a Russian ambassador, Soviet ambassador in Washington, D.C., who was not only meeting with the government officially, but working a back channel to the Kennedy White House. And there were similar lines of communication being opened up with Nikita Khrushchev in the Soviet Union. There was dialogue taking place. And as a result, they were able to manage this crisis and avoid a decisive confrontation, avoid a war. And a lot of people say that's the closest we came to a nuclear conflict. Well, today we have a situation where there is no slow-moving convoy heading to each other. We basically have given the Ukrainians permission to fire long-range, precision-guided American-made munitions into Russia, ostensibly to strike places in Russia that are being used to attack Ukraine. There's a couple flaws in this thinking on the part of the West. First is the notion of we can't let Russia have a safe haven. You see, if Russia is going to launch attacks from inside Russian territory against Ukraine, then Ukraine must have the ability to strike back into Russia. I say, well, if that's the case, then what about the safe haven that Ukraine has today in Europe, in NATO? You know, the one where they have airplanes, they have pilots being trained on F-16s in Belgium and elsewhere. In any war situation, those would be legitimate targets and should be struck. What about the tank repair facilities that exist in Poland, in Germany, in the Baltic nations? If you take a piece of combat equipment off the battlefield and are repairing it to send it back to the battlefield, that becomes a legitimate target of war, the repair facility. What about the warehouses where weapons that are being sent to Ukraine are being stored in advance? Those are legitimate targets. The lines of communication, the free flow of material and manpower. You know, it's basically the NATO version of the Ho Chi Minh Trail, going back to Vietnam. That North Vietnam ran out of North Vietnam, then down Laos and into Cambodia along the western border of South Vietnam, where they would just move their logistics. And the United States was frustrated because they're saying, we can't fight them in South Vietnam and all this material is coming in. So we began to bomb the Ho Chi Minh Trail. We began to launch commando attacks. We invaded we invaded Cambodia to run a war to prevent this safe haven from happening. We know what it means to have a safe haven, and we know what it means, but what we have to do in response. We know what we did. And yet we're telling the Russians, oh, you can't attack NATO because of Article 5. Oh, attack against one, attack against all. So we are creating this safe haven. We know that it's by employing this safe haven the way we do, that we are becoming parties to the conflicts, but we won't admit that. And then we have the hypocrisy of telling the Russians, but you can't have a safe haven. Russia has reminded everybody over and over again that this isn't a war. This is a special military operation. If you want to make it a war, then that's something totally different. But this is a special military operation. Now, Ukraine is firing these missiles. What makes these missiles being fired from Ukrainian soil particularly sensitive to the Russians? We go back to the Soviet Union times when Ukraine was part of the Soviet Union. And then you had a Warsaw Pact of Eastern Bloc nations. Western missiles were actually pushed way, way, way to the west, and they were deployed in West Germany and the Netherlands and Italy and the United Kingdom. But it took a while when those missiles launched to get to Russia. Give Russia some time to assess, is this a real launch? What's really going on? Was it a mistake? Do we need to immediately retaliate? There was a buffer built in there, sort of reminiscent of the Cuban Missile Crisis. Time to consider actions. One of the great dangers of the later stage of the Cold War in the 1980s is when we deployed the Pershing II missile into West Germany, because the Pershing II was a solid rocket missile with very fast flying. And suddenly, instead of having 20 to 30 minutes to talk things over, you had 5 to 7 minutes when that thing was launched before it hit the Kremlin, which means there's no time to talk. That's why I always tell people, when you meet a former weapons inspector who implemented the Intermediate Nuclear Forces Treaty, buy them a beer, shake their hand, and thank them for keeping you alive. Because by implementing the INF Treaty, we saved the world. There would have been a nuclear war. There's no doubt in my mind there would have been a nuclear war, one that killed everybody, because these weapons were so destabilizing. But we got rid of them, and that was a good thing. The Russians, when they built their command and control for their nuclear warfighting capability, their early warning radars, some of their advanced missile locations, did so under the assumption that you had this buffer, Eastern European buffer, the Belarus and Ukraine, and then you come into Russia proper, Central Russia. Now, with the collapse of the Soviet Union, the collapse of the Warsaw Pact, those Eastern nations went away. They now become part of NATO. NATO moves up, and Russians are going, hey, you're getting a little close. We don't like this. Don't get so close. But we kept coming. And now we want to take Ukraine away. And if you take Ukraine away, it's like a giant ice cream scoop, just scooping out the center of Russia's land buffer. And now, if that becomes NATO and NATO puts missiles in there, you literally have missiles that are going that enable Ukraine, as part of NATO, to launch a first strike against Russian command and control, nuclear command and control, early warning radars, missile launch facilities, national command. And the Russians went, that will never happen. You're never going to be allowed to do this, ever. That's why William Burns in 2008 wrote that memorandum. Niet means niet, no means no. And he said, the Russians mean this. If we being the United States, seek to bring Ukraine into NATO, William Burns wrote in early 2008, there will be a civil war in Ukraine. What do you think the Maidan coup was? What do you think the Donbass? It's a civil war where ethnic Russians rose up against Ukrainian nationalists, a civil war, a conflict that will lead to Russian military intervention that will result in Ukraine at a minimum losing Crimea and the Donbass. Well, what did Ukraine lose? Crimea, the Donbass, oh yeah, and Kherson and Zaporizhia. This was a predictable outcome. We knew exactly what would happen, but we did it anyways because a lot of people believe that the Russians are bluffing, that the Russians are weak, that the Russians won't follow through. Ray McGovern, who I believe is also a friend of your show, former CIA analyst, a very, very smart man, talked about how in December of 2021, when the Russians put in their draft treaties to resolve this conflict peacefully, one of their big concerns was American missiles or NATO missiles ending up in Ukraine, threatening Moscow and these command centers. And indeed, there was a period of time where the Russian negotiators and American negotiators met in, I believe it was Geneva, Switzerland, where they talked about this. And at first, the Americans promised, I think Joe Biden promised Vladimir Putin, oh, we'll never put missiles in Ukraine. We'll never, we have no intention of doing that whatsoever. And Putin's like, good, that makes things very easy because if we can get this in guaranteed in a treaty form, we maybe can ease up on some of our other conditions. Our big concern are the missiles. And Biden's like, don't worry about it. But then when the negotiators met with the Russians, suddenly they weren't talking about missiles. The Russian goes, hey, we want to nail down this missile thing. And they're going, no, that's too restrictive on NATO. We can't do that. We can't impose. We want to have that there's no missiles, but we can't impose that up front because that makes us look like we're yielding to your demands. And of course, we can't be seen as yielding to the demands of Russia, no matter how reasonable they are. And the Russians the whole time are going, wait a minute, Biden said no missiles. You're saying you can't. So the Russians knew from day one that the Americans were going to be bringing in these missiles into Ukraine, and they used them to attack. And so what Russia has done is say as forcefully as possible that this is an unacceptable expansion of the conflict, one that represents a existential threat to the survival of the Russian state. It's non-nuclear, but nonetheless, missiles fired that take out nuclear command and control, take out early warning radars, etc., becomes an existential. And don't believe Scott Ritter. All those people are, Scott Ritter doesn't know what he's talking about. He's an idiot. Well, maybe, but maybe not. We'll find out. But talk to the United States, read America's nuclear doctrine, where we speak about cyber attacks. And one of the interesting things about the verbiage we use to describe cyber attacks and the consequences, we say that if there's a cyber attack that threatens to shut down national command and control communications, the ability of the president to communicate with his nuclear command people, with his early warning systems, with the weapon systems themselves. If there's a cyber attack that does this, then the United States is allowed to assume that it's the precursor of a larger attack, and then we can preemptively strike any threat that we've deemed. So you hit us with a cyber attack that threatens our nuclear infrastructure, and we're allowed to assume that it's an attack on our nuclear infrastructure designed to to take it out. And so we will preempt that by using our nuclear infrastructure to take out the source of the cyber attack. Well, gosh, if we can do that for a cyber attack, aren't the Russians allowed to do that when actual missiles strike? When ATACMS missiles or HIMARS missiles are used to strike these targets in Russia that represent part of their new, and it's not theoretical, ladies and gentlemen, at least two Russian early warning radar sites that have nothing to do with the war in Ukraine and everything to do with Russia's ability to detect new missile launches that could have a nuclear dimension to them. So we've already allowed Ukraine to attack Russia's nuclear infrastructure. We've allowed Ukraine to launch an attack against Ingalls Air Base, where they destroyed some strategic bombers. Again, one of the key aspects of Russia's nuclear doctrine is if you attack our nuclear infrastructure, including the weapon systems used to deliver nuclear weapons, even if you attack them in a non-nuclear manner, we will be allowed to respond as if we were being struck with nuclear weapons. So Ukraine has attacked Russia's nuclear bomber fields in Ingalls. They've attacked at least two nuclear-related early warning systems, and now they have missiles that can attack command and control and actual nuclear-capable missile sites. What is Russia supposed to do? Nothing. Stand back and do nothing. And so I have been saying that we are one ATACMS missile attack away from a nuclear conflict, that all it takes is the Ukrainians to fire one missile that hits the wrong target on the wrong day with the wrong people in it, and we're going nuclear. And that's just a statement of fact. Now, what has Vladimir Putin done? Now, in the lead up to the St. Petersburg International Economic Forum, the Russians were saying things, not necessarily Putin, but Dmitry Medvedev, who sort of is the bad cop to Putin's good cop, and others, including very influential political and military commentators on Russian media, were saying that, Russia, if the West does this, if the Germans use their they provide with the Taurus missiles, or if the French give them Scout missiles that are targeted, or if the Germans give them Storm Shadows that are targeted. Because understand, when I say targeted, Ukraine can't target any of these systems. Everybody, let the Ukrainians fight. Okay. But if you let the Ukrainians fight, they can't use these weapon systems. Why? Because they all are GPS-driven systems. Now, you say, well, Scott, Ukrainians have a GPS downlink capability. That shouldn't be a problem. Yeah, but what makes these weapons work isn't just the GPS, it's that they can be updated with very precise intelligence information that can only be gathered by the United States and NATO using their satellite reconnaissance capabilities, using aircraft that loiter in the vicinity, using other capabilities. They gather this information, and then they're able to build a strike package, not just about the target, but what's protecting the target, where the radar envelopes are, where terrain combines with a gap in coverage to create the potential for a drone to navigate its way through without being detected. And remember, because the Russians, like any professional military, are constantly moving their air defense, even as you prepare the attack, the satellites are looking for changes, and then their updates are being sent again. Now, these updates are being sent along very sensitive communications channels capable of transmitting top secret, what they call special compartmented information, SCI material. When you have TSSCI, it's automatically no foreign. That means no foreigner. Ukraine can't touch it. So the Ukrainians can't, they're not sitting there at a satellite downlink waiting for the printout to come out of the American targeting data. The Ukrainians are in another room. The Americans bring in the targeting data. Now, we have to load it into the various weapon systems. That's a technical capability that Ukrainians simply don't have. They're not trained to do. So we take the intelligence that we collected based upon a target that we selected, and then we give it to American hands who puts the guidance information into the weapon system, and then and only then does the Ukrainian hand come out and push the button. It's an attack by America against Russia. That's literally what's happening here. And the Russians have said that this could lead to nuclear war. But Vladimir Putin, again, I know in America we don't like to talk about this, but hey, guys, thank him, because he's the only adult in the room. He's the man who said, I'm not going to continue climbing the escalation ladder. I'm looking for a way off. I'm going to add, at a minimum, add more rungs so that the climb is a little bit longer. We buy a little bit more time. We're not rushing to nuclear conflict. So he said, look, we understand what you guys are getting ready to do, and we understand who's responsible. But rather than us directly attacking you, you can play at this game. You want to attack us using your weapons through a proxy, Ukraine. We will find third parties around the world who will serve as our proxies, and we will give them long-range precision-guided weaponry that's capable of striking the United States and Europe, or both, if the conflict expands to their territory. So if the United States, for instance, sought to bomb Libya again, maybe this time the Libyans have been equipped with long-range missiles that can be fired and take out sites inside Ukraine, and maybe part of the inside Europe. I'm sorry, and maybe part of the deal that Russia is going to cut with these nations is a mutual security pact, so that these nations, if Russia is attacked or something happens, are going to be obligated to respond, and they will use these long-range precision-guided munitions to take out sites inside the United Kingdom, inside Europe, that otherwise would be incapable of being attacked. And so, what he did is he created this possibility. Then immediately everybody in the West panicked. My God, the Russians are doing this. Have they done it already? Where would these missiles go? And then Putin came out at the plenary session and said, we haven't done it yet. It's something we're considering. But, maybe if the West picks up the phone and calls me and tells me that they're not going to attack us or they're going to back down, maybe we won't do it. You see what he did there? He bought time. He created additional rungs up the escalation ladder. He is, tried to de-escalate this rush towards war. He's the only adult in the room, as I said earlier, and it's his policies that have given me vague hope that we can somehow navigate out of these troubled waters and into smooth sailing ahead. But it isn't because the Biden administration is avoiding conflict, or Emmanuel Macron in France is avoiding. It's because Vladimir Putin is avoiding conflict, and Vladimir Putin's doing everything in his power to limit the potential of direct conflict. How long he can do this, only heaven knows. We do know that the West continues to view any effort by Russia to avoid confrontation as being a sign of weakness, that somehow Russia, is intimidated, they've backed down, etc. That's not the case. Russia's a very strong nation. Russia just doesn't want to commit suicide. They don't want a nuclear conflict. If you look at the St. Petersburg International Economic Forum, the final plenary session, Vladimir Putin didn't start off by talking about the dangers in the world that exist. He talked about BRICS, about economic issues, Russia's growing economy, Russia's trade with other neighbors, and how Russia will use BRICS to cement a coalition of nations that will provide the rest of the world an alternative to the G7, group of 7 nations headed by the United States that seek to impose their will on them. This is very much the year of Russia, but the year of Russia scares the hell out of the West, and so for the moment, the West is leaning aggressively forward, trying to intimidate Russia, to somehow convince the Russian people to rise up against Vladimir Putin, to convince Vladimir Putin that there's no chance that Russia can prevail. None of that resonates in Russia. Anybody who's been following Russia understands the importance of what happened in March when Putin won re-election. Overwhelming turnout, overwhelming percentage of those who turned out voting in favor. This is a mandate. And then listen to what he said on May 7th in his inauguration, and you see that Putin's taking Russia down a completely new path, one that has everything to restoring Russia to its to the status it should enjoy, given the size and strength of the nation. But this scares the United States. It's the last thing we want from Russia at this point in time.
Yes, and we do have to talk about the debacle, the just chaos and just horrors that Israel is committing. But before we do, there's a question that I think is really good coming from the Patreon community here, from someone named Alex, and I think it goes really well with a video from your friend Lindsey Graham, Scott Ritter, because he was on Face the Nation recently, and he outlined essentially projecting onto Russia, of course, these certain fears, but almost revealed himself what the United States, what NATO is really concerned about when it comes to Russia and its impending victory in Ukraine. And so here's what he had to say.
What did Trump do to get the weapons flowing? He created a loan system. They're sitting on 10 to 12 trillion dollars of critical minerals in Ukraine. They could be the richest country in all of Europe. I don't want to give that money and those assets to Putin to share with China. If we help Ukraine now, they can become the best business partner we ever dreamed of. That 10 to 12 trillion dollars of critical mineral assets could be used by Ukraine and the West, not given to Putin and China. This is a very big deal how Ukraine ends. Let's help them win a war we can't afford to lose. Let's find a solution to this war. But they're sitting on a gold mine to give Putin 10 or 12 trillion dollars of critical minerals that he will share with us.
So that's what Lindsey Graham had to say. The question, though, from Alex, I think provides a good contrast that you can provide insight into, Scott. He said, when will Russia know that it has won the special military operation, and what are the specific objectives for Russian victory? Now, this question is a good one because, according to Lindsey Graham, one of the specific objectives is to essentially take Ukraine's wealth and, of course, hand it to its best friend China. But what's the reality, Scott, that Lindsey Graham is maybe taking our eyes away from or diverting from when he makes comments such as these?
Well, I think we, first of all, need to reflect on the reality that what Lindsey Graham says is reflective of an overarching policy posture by the United States when it comes to Russia. Go back to the early 1990s, the collapse of the Soviet Union, and the Russia that emerged from that. It's one of the ugliest periods of Russian history, and I would say it's one of the uglier periods of American history too, and indeed the history of the collective West, because rather than extending a helping hand to Russia, we put our foot on Russia's throat, and we helped install a very weak, corrupt leader named Boris Yeltsin, whom we exploited. In fact, all this talk about about Russian interference in American elections that turned out to be false. In 1996, America got Boris Yeltsin reelected, and it was such an egregious affront that Time magazine even made it a cover as best election money can buy. So we stole an election in Russia, gave it to Boris Yeltsin for the purpose of keeping Russia politically weak, and to steal mineral resources from Russia, from the former Soviet Union. But there was an overarching objective of breaking Russia up into its constituent parts. This is what the Chechen conflict was all about. It was a CIA-backed operation designed to promote succession movements, to get the Muslims of the Russian Federation to rise up against. It wasn't just designed in Chechnya, that they were hoping that a successful Yanks to the rescue, there it is, that the successful secession of Chechnya would lead to a similar withdrawal from the Russian Federation by by Tatarstan and maybe Bashkiria and other Muslim entities, and this would lead further to the breakup of Russia, the Far East breaking in, Siberia breaking away. Russia would become not a singular federation, but actually turn into a a series of independent states who are weak and could be easily controlled and dominated. This was the strategic thinking of the United States, which is why we're so mad at Vladimir Putin for not playing the game and for stepping in and building a strong Russia. But so Lindsey is right when he reflects on this. But let's talk about what he says about Putin. I mean, apparently Lindsey knows Putin very well because he can speak on behalf of Putin and Xi Jinping. Lindsey's wrong. And is this me just saying this? He said, she said. Guess who the she is? Not me. Sorry, I didn't mean to go there. I just don't like Lindsey Graham. That was a very crude thing for me to say. So I apologize. But Lindsey Graham, I don't like him. He is implying that it was Putin's strategic objective to strip these materials, this material wealth away from Ukraine. We know that's a lie. Why do we know that's a lie? Well, there's this thing called the Istanbul Communique. Let's look at some of the mineral wealth that he talks about. One of them is lithium. Now, I'm not the world's smartest person, but I do know that lithium is a key component in the production of batteries, electric batteries that play an important role in creating electric cars, et cetera, in the future. And that the nation that controls lithium production is going to be in the driver's seat when it comes to producing electric vehicles. And China, has sort of the corner on the market. And I think you'd be foolish to say, well, let's let China get control of everything. So I understand the intent there, but the Istanbul Communique was going to return. There's two places where these lithium fields exist in economically viable quantities. One is in Zaporizhia, one of the oblasts or territories of the new Russia that's been taken over by Russia. But Zaporizhia was going to be returned to the Ukrainians. Now, if the Russians wanted to keep those mineral resources, Lindsey Graham said, why is Russia giving Zaporizhia, with one of the largest exploitable lithium fields in the region, back to Ukraine? It shows that Lindsey Graham's a liar. The second place is Donetsk and the Donbass. Those fields are actually more viable because I guess it's easier to extract the lithuanium from these fields. But again, the way that the Istanbul Communique was structured is that Russia couldn't speak on behalf of an independent entity, and the Donbass, Donetsk and Lugansk, had declared their independence from Ukraine through referendums that took place on the eve of the Russian initiation of the special military operation. So Russia said, look, it's independent, but what we guarantee is that we will work with Ukraine and the international community to hold referenda on the future of the Donbass. Will it opt to return to Ukraine with its rights guaranteed? Will they opt to be independent, or will they opt to join Russia? What Russia said is there's no foregone outcome here. We will, let the will of the people, in accordance with the United Nations Charter, play out. But Russia, that's not how you operate if your goal is to seize control of lithium fields and transfer this to China. So Lindsey Graham is just making stuff up. He's literally manufacturing a case out of thin air. The facts don't back up what he says. It's not Putin's intention to steal this material. It's just stupidity on Lindsey Graham's part. But then again, we're talking about Lindsey Graham, and pretty much everything he says and does is stupid.
Indeed. And lastly on this, maybe, Scott, if you could just talk about, not a lot has been spoken about in terms of the battlefield. If you could give a quick summary on the battlefield, because I feel like a lot of this escalation ladder climbing that NATO is doing, and a lot of the commentary you hear coming out of the U.S. political class, does have an kind of an air of desperation. But yet Bloomberg, I saw a report recently saying that, well, Russia's so-called offensive that it's waging right now in Kharkov and other areas of the front line, time is coming up soon because the billions of dollars of weapons that were promised to Ukraine from the United States are on their way. So maybe a quick summary on the reality there.
I'll just postulate this for your audience. Okay, let's say I'm Ukraine, and I've taken a couple bad blows. I'm bloodied, but I'm trying to slow down the battlefield to receive weapons, and then I'm going to use those weapons to alter the outcome on the battlefield. When I gather these weapons, is it better that I use them the way that I want to use them based upon a plan that I've come up to achieve the results? Or as the weapons come in, do I immediately send them to battlefields on the front line that are picked by Russia, that Russia's determined this is where the fight's going to be? And therefore I lose control of these assets. They're taken out of my hands as they come in. They're gone. They're on the battlefield. Oh, I've lost control. Russia's controlling the battlefield. That's what's happening here. Russia is creating the circumstances in which it dictates how Ukraine is going to use these weapons that Bloomberg talks about. Ukraine's not going to be able to assemble them into some sort of strategic reserve, where Ukraine is going to have to immediately send them to the battlefield based upon what Russia is doing. And what is Russia doing? Russia, again, Vladimir Putin talked about this. That's why I always encourage people to attend the St. Petersburg International Economic Forum. If you can't, to at least monitor it and listen to what the Russian president has to say. But he said some interesting things, including that Russia could win this war very soon, but it would require massive offensive operations that would kill a lot of Russian soldiers. He said, we're not in the business of killing a lot of Russian soldiers. We don't, that's not what we want to do. It's also interesting, just as a little tangent, that Putin hinted for the first time about the level of Russia's casualties. And he speaks of what are known as irretrievable losses. These are dead and wounded to the point that you can't be returned to the battlefield. If you threw out a number, say 500,000 irretrievable Ukrainian losses, some people, myself included, would say there's more than that. Others would say there's less. Let's just call that a happy middle ground, 500,000. Russia said that it's 1 to 5, that for every 5 Ukrainian irretrievable losses, there's 1 Russian irretrievable loss. That means 100,000 Russians have become irretrievable losses. This in a war that's just slightly over 2 years in length. The United States lost 58,000 men in Vietnam over the course of 10 years, and that broke our nation, broke our back. We lost the will to continue the fight. But the Russians are getting stronger. If it took 2 years to have 100,000 irretrievable losses, understand that Russia is gaining recruits at a rate of 50,000 a month in some cases. 30 to 50,000 a month are joining to be trained to come and fight in the special military operation. So even if the Russian losses are high, and 100,000 is very high, the Russia's making up for it. Russia can continue to fight. What Putin is saying is we don't want to. The modern war is bloody enough as it is. We don't want to do things on the battlefield that cause Russians to die. We prefer to cause the enemy to die. And again, 500,000 is a lot of dead or irretrievably lost Ukrainians. So Russia's goal has been to advance where you can, but where the Ukrainians decide they want to fight, then to push, stop, dig in, and then initiate the meat grinder operation. Bring in the fab bombs, the guided bombs with the wings that fly in and hit targets. The aircraft never have to reach the forward edge of the battlefield. Artillery supremacy, missile supremacy, drone supremacy, and basically grind the Ukrainians down so that you've now created what we've seen in the past, the Bakhmut effect, where the Ukrainians commit to a battle, and then in order to prevail in the battle, just keep pouring resources in until 90,000 troops later, they're out of resources. Or we can talk about the Avdiivka effect, another battle where the Ukrainians just kept pouring in resources until they ran out of resources. In both battles, Bakhmut and Avdiivka, once the Ukrainians ran out of resources, they had to retreat, and Russia advanced and took that territory and then continues to advance slowly. What's happening in Kharkov? Russia opened up a northern front. The purpose of this front ostensibly is to create a buffer zone. But the Russians advanced as far as they could without over committing the offensive and losing people. They advanced as far as they could, and now the Ukrainians have rushed reinforcements in, and they've frozen the lines. But that's to Russia's advantage, because now Russia is involved in meat grinder operations. And now we have a meat grinder taking place there. We have another meat grinder taking place in Donetsk. We have another meat grinder taking place in Zaporizhia. And as these weapons come flowing in with whatever limited manpower Ukraine is able to mobilize, the meat grinder is consuming them based upon Russia's initiative, not Ukraine's. And guess what? And now the Russians have opened up another front near Sumy. Now another meat grinder. There's talk about Russia opening up, a front in Kherson. You have the Ukrainians actually evacuating Kherson now because they can't defend it. They don't have troops. And so, Russia could be going back there. The bottom line is Russia is going to build meat grinder operations all along the front. So Ukraine throws in its resources, grinds them up. And then when they're out of resources, Russia does what it does. It keeps advancing. This is inexorable. It can't be stopped. It's proof positive that, Russia is winning. And even with all this new NATO equipment and stuff, it's not enough. Basic military math shows that Russia is accumulating military power every day that this war goes on. They're gaining more strength than is being lost on the battlefield by a significant number. The Ukrainians, on the other hand, are losing more strength on the battlefield than is being replenished, even with this NATO assistance. So no matter what, the disparity between the two forces is the gap is just growing even larger in favor of Russia. So that's what's going on. I'll leave you with this thing. Putin has always been saying that the calendar doesn't drive this operation. That, we're not talking about victory by this month or by this month or by this month. Victory happens when victory happens. Victory is defined by denazification, getting rid of all of the Banderist supporters in the Ukrainian government, to include the Zelensky government and anybody affiliated with him. The Russians have sought to isolate Zelensky politically, both at home and abroad, by questioning the constitutionality of his mandate. But it's so they're attacking Zelensky domestically, but they're also attacking Zelensky abroad, basically saying that this is a man who doesn't represent the Ukrainian people, that this is a dictatorship, etc. And the implication that Putin gave is that he expects Zelensky to stay in power through this year into next year, and that next year he believes that this problem will go away. But if you've built denazification around removing Zelensky and his government, and you're saying it's going to take another year, I think Putin just told us something there, that he's in no rush to win this war. I know I've quoted Russian generals who've told me, no, the battlefield's changing in May, it's going to be decisive, and then you're going to see even bigger map changes. But I think that they may have made those statements assuming that they were going to do big arrow operations. And the Russian government has said, we don't have a mandate. We have a mandate to win. We don't have a mandate to win at any cost. And we're not going to do these big arrow operations, which now only 23% of the Ukrainian energy infrastructure is up and running. And even if the war stopped today, they wouldn't be able to get that infrastructure up and running by wintertime. One can definitely understand that in what's left of the summer season, that Russia is going to try and reduce that 23% to as close to zero as possible, so that Ukraine is facing a disaster when wintertime comes. And if it's a harsh winter, Ukraine may not survive as a nation. And that's part of Russia's strategy. Remember, Putin said, I'm not in the business of killing Russian soldiers. We need to preserve as many Russian lives as possible. So we're going to do things that puts maximum pressure on Ukraine to willingly go to a table and say, yes, we're ready to surrender. So that's my take on the battlefield. It's a bloody meat grinder operation where Russia is in control, but Russia is not committed to any timeline. Russia is committed to accomplishment of objectives. And again, the fact that the United States and Europe are pouring money into Ukraine, it changes the game. It's a game changer. It doesn't mean Russia loses. Russia's not going to lose this war, but the game has changed. New realities have come into play that Russia has to adapt to. And so I think Russia's strategy is a strategy of patience and perseverance. Just wait and let the situation develop in a way that's to the exclusive benefit of Russia. And in this case, that means that the Russians are killing far more Ukrainians than can be replaced. And the Russians are ensuring that whatever replacements they bring in exceeds the number of Russians that the Ukrainians are killing.
And that is the analysis you do not get from Bloomberg and the Western mainstream media. Before we move on, everybody, make sure you hit that like button. A lot of strange things have been happening on YouTube live streams of late. So be sure to hit that like button to keep people flowing in to hear Scott. Scott, I wanted to get to Israel now, and I really wanted to talk to you about this, given the implications of what just happened with regard to this so-called rescue operation. I saw some of your commentary on X about it, but let's talk about this. So on June 8th, Israel, alongside the United States, conducted what it is calling one of the most successful rescue operations that it has undertaken since the October 7th, what some call a prison break, others call a terrorist attack, depending on where you sit on the line. But 4 Israeli captives were, freed by Israel, but they killed 3 that we know of. And not only this, but 270 plus Palestinians were killed at the Nuseirat refugee camp. And the United States was heavily involved in this operation. There were some who were speculating, although the U.S. denies this, that the pier that we saw half floating in the sea just a couple weeks ago, some speculated that pier, and there's video footage that kind of makes it a little very legitimate to speculate that pier was being used to essentially aid Israel in what was a massacre rather than a military operation. Can you talk about your reaction to this, and where does it fall within where Israel stands right now in this broader war that you could call it, genocide, others call it, in Gaza? What does this really reflect?
First of all, I think we need to be honest about what happened. It was a military operation designed to free Israeli citizens who were being held against their will by Hamas. We can call those people hostages if you want to use that term. Prisoners of war if they were military, if they were civilian, hostages. And on the face of it, of course Israel has a right to do that. I know there's the argument, it's an illegal occupier. I use that argument all the time. You can't argue, you can't complain when the enemy, when people resist you and all that kind of stuff. I agree. But if Hamas, the whole purpose of Hamas taking the hostages was to bring them into Gaza and compel Israel to carry out military operations designed to free the hostages. That's what this whole thing is about. And so Israel, this has become a political problem for Israel. And this is what we need to focus on, is the political problem of the hostages. It's been one of the issues that have been hounding the Netanyahu administration. Indeed, as we speak, his government is collapsing around him. Benny Gantz, the Minister of Defense, one of his key political opponents, has left the war cabinet. He's no longer part of the government. He's been followed by at least 3 others. And this may lead to, Israel being compelled to carry out elections in a time of war. Netanyahu is under a lot of pressure to resign because he's not defeating Hamas. He's not defeating Hezbollah. He's not ending this confrontation. Iran got the better of him, and yet he knows that if he doesn't do something, he's going to have to. It's inevitable that he'd be pushed out. So this operation was designed to buy him time. It was a successful hostage rescue operation. That's how it's being spun. That he, Benjamin Netanyahu, is the brave Israeli leader that will never give up on hostages. I mean, this is a tremendous propaganda victory for Israel in Israel. It's something that the Israelis desperately needed as a nation. You look at the videotapes of the lifeguards announcing the rescue over the radio to all the people on the beach in Tel Aviv and how they're cheering and clapping. I mean, this is a big deal. This is a much needed boost in the arm from Benjamin Netanyahu, which tells you everything you need to know about why he did it. Because let me tell you this is the worst hostage rescue operation in the history of hostage rescue operations. First of all, there was no military necessity for this operation. It's clear that the 4 hostages who were released were being well fed. They weren't being tortured. They weren't being raped. They weren't they're being held against their will. And I'm not legitimizing this whatsoever. No matter how much I support the Hamas cause, I understand the reality that if you seize citizens of another nation, don't be surprised when that other nation comes in looking for those citizens through use of force. So, Israel had every right to do what it's doing. But not how it did it. You see, these hostages could have been released through negotiation, the acceptance of a ceasefire. In fact, there's a Security Council just voted in support of the American proposal for a ceasefire in Gaza, one which has a hostage release component built into it. So all Israel had to do, there was no military necessity. These hostages weren't being executed. The only hostages that have died in Hamas are hostages who died because Israel fired missiles through. One of the surviving hostages talk about that, how she knows that Israeli missiles killed Israeli hostages. The only hostages that died at the hands of the Israeli Defense Force. All of these hostages could have been released simply by Israel agreeing to a ceasefire on terms that bring about an end to the conflict. Israel wouldn't do this. So you can't speak of military necessity. There was political necessity, and that's never a justification. Just because Benjamin Netanyahu needs a shot in the arm doesn't ever justify this. What made this assault a crime? Under international humanitarian law, under the laws of war, under the Geneva Conventions, proportionality is a factor that has to be brought into play when talking about carrying out strikes that could result in civilian casualties. The law of war doesn't say that you can't kill civilians. What it says is that the losses of civilians must be in proportion to the military gain achieved by the operation. And since I already told you there was no military imperative here, no military gain, that means that no civilians could be killed. There's no reason to kill any, let alone over 200, plus. I mean, I don't know what the exact number is now. It's over 240, I think, dead. No, that's unacceptable. And it's not just, here's the interesting thing, it's not just me saying this or the International Court of Justice or the International Criminal Court. In 2004, the Israeli Supreme Court talked about proportionality, saying that Israel doesn't have a right to go in and carry out operations that will result in, significant civilian life, and ignore the proportionality question. And so we have a massive war crime that took place. There's no defending this whatsoever. There's not a court of jurisdiction that, if it took up this case, wouldn't find against Israel here, because literally there's no aspect of this that meets the proportionality aspect of it. But there's also what this did to America and the reputation of the United States. I don't think there's a person out here who follows this, who looked at what America was doing with this pier off the coast of Gaza and said, that's a brilliant idea. Why didn't I drink the V8 and get this one, man? If I had just drinking a V8, I could have come up with this idea, and it's genius. I mean, let's spend $340 some odd million and build a pier where we could get humanitarian stuff to come off, and it goes to the Palestinian people. But, oh, wait, it doesn't really, does it? Because there's not too much to come off. The pier is very fragile. Windstorm comes up, pier gets washed away. All knowable events. Guys, go study the Battle of Normandy. We just had the 80th anniversary of the Battle of Normandy. And study the concept of mulberry harbors and what that means, protecting, artificial man-made piers or jetties from weather. Right after D-Day, the weather came in and swept away, blew up the mulberry harbors, and screwed up the whole offloading that was supposed to take place. We know that it's almost impossible to do that. I'll give away something about my background too. In the lead up to the Gulf War, I was on a planning cell working directly for the Commandant of the Marine Corps to plan combat options, amphibious warfare options for the Marine Corps, because General Schwarzkopf at that time had 2 Marine divisions assigned, and his whole thing was put the Marines right up against the strongest Iraqi defenses and charge straight into the lines. Now, Marines aren't cowards. We've done this before. We could do it. But, we sat there and went, we really don't want to build another Iwo Jima memorial about the Iraq War. There's got to be a better way to use Marines, where instead of putting us on the ground like 2 Army divisions, we're an amphibious force. And so one of my concepts, actually it was a concept that I came up with, was to take a core-sized element and insert it on the Al-Faw Peninsula and then advance rapidly into the Iraqi rear, cutting off the Al-Zubair logistics base from Baghdad to the Kuwaiti forces, putting them in the horns of a dilemma where if they left their trenches, they'd get bombed. If they stayed in place, they'd starve to death. Classic amphibious operation kind of stuff. And the problem we had was there's no port facility. There's Qasr, but that easily mined, etc. How do you get Marines over the beach fast enough, ready to fight? I came up with the idea that we're going to build. This is actually a pretty clever idea. I'm pretty proud of it. We're going to build a pier, but the way we're going to build the pier is you take what's called a roll-on, roll-off ship, and you take the first roll-on, roll-off ship. On that ship, you have a Marine rifle company already lined up in its combat march order. And that ship comes in and runs aground on the beach. Seabees come out and improve that front, and then the companies ride off. Now, roll-on, roll-off allows vehicles to enter the back and roll out the front. And then behind it comes another roll-on, roll-off that comes in and links up with this one. And that company leaves its ship, goes on the other ship in. We're building a pier, and we just keep lining them up all the way across. There it is. And we have 3 of these things because you need, things. And this came up in the mind of a stupid captain. And it passed muster. Everybody said it was genius. We're going to do it. But one of the things we were concerned about was weather. Okay, we got these ships all linked up like some giant centipede. And what happens if the weather comes in and just blows the crap away? And I didn't have the answer for that. My answer was, we need to basically get a division on shore and have a regiment peel off and secure Qasr, and then we would use the Qasr port facilities. And that was the plan, because we didn't have time to build a mulberry harbor to protect it. If bad weather had come in, it could have caused problems. But what I'm trying to point out is that people who do this for a living plan these things. We know what the history of military operations are. And anybody sitting there trying to put a pier off of Gaza has to know about weather, has to know about tidal surges, has to know about every aspect of it. That's why we have, intelligence officers who are supposed to have tasked the divers to go in and put in sensors and check the water flow and check everything out and make sure that all the calculations are done so the pier is done. it's the dumbest idea in the world to put this pier in, which now you have to ask the question, well, why did they put the pier in? Because the pier is ideally located to gather intelligence against Hamas, to provide an observation platform into areas of Gaza, where you can do visual observation and you can do technical surveillance of this. And it's done by the United States in coordination with Israeli intelligence. It's also a perfect staging ground. We talk about getting humanitarian goods in there, but it allows vehicles to be staged that operate under the cover of humanitarian operations. We know that the Israelis used humanitarian vehicles to deploy their troops. One of the trucks was designed to mimic the transfer of displaced persons, that move around. And there's no doubt in my mind that the Israelis probably rehearsed this, meaning they sent, fake runs through the area just to get the locals used to seeing this kind of vehicle moving. But this came off of the pier. So the Israeli forces deployed to the pier disguised as American forces, and then they fell in on these vehicles, and they deployed. In the United States, what had to have been involved in the command and control, the logistics, the planning of this. So the United States was involved in this operation that turned into a war crime because they slaughtered over 220 civilians to rescue 4 hostages. They killed at least 3 other hostages. If this had been an American operation, I can guarantee you that there would be a congressional inquiry and there would be court-martials of the officers in charge. This was not a military success, not at all. They killed 3 hostages, one of whom is an American. I don't know why the United States Congress isn't outraged. The one question I would ask is, how did this come to be? Did we know the Israelis were going in after an American citizen? What measures did we do to protect this American? Why did we allow the Israelis to carry out a military operation to rescue an American citizen when, if they simply did the ceasefire, this person could have been freed without any harm? And then the final one is, why did we allow the Israelis to commit war crimes? And here's the interesting part. Nobody's talking about this. There's something called the Leahy Law, named after the former senator, I believe, from the state of Vermont. I could be wrong on that one, Patrick Leahy. The Leahy Law prevents America from providing money to military units of a nation that we're providing support to, who have committed what are known as gross violation of human rights. Well, what happened in this hostage rescue is a gross violation of human rights. So all of the elite Israeli special forces units, Yaman, Sayed Matkal, there's a number of others that were involved in this. All of those now, by law, by American law, have to be reviewed. Because if they committed gross violation of humanitarian of human rights, which they did by disregarding the notion of proportionality, then we can't give them money. We can't work with them. We have to ostracize them. Is this happening? The answer is no. See, America ignores its laws, and now we come to the final outcome of this. This has destroyed the reputation of the United States as an impartial arbiter. We can never again be trusted. We can only be seen as unilaterally supporting Israel across the board. When we create an object, a pier, that we say is for humanitarian purposes, and then we use it for military purposes, who can trust us again? This was a one-time operation. They're not going to be able to launch another operation like this using this pier. This was a one-of. Which means you have to question then, what about this was so important? Was it really so important to get 4 hostages rescued when over 120 remain in captivity? And the answer is yes, from a political standpoint. This was an act of political desperation by Benjamin Netanyahu. He was so desperate that he basically burned the pier. The pier can't be used like this anymore. and it really can't be used as an intelligence gathering thing, because your visual observations now have to operate under the assumption that Hamas knows they're being watched. Therefore, what you're seeing is probably deception. And the signals, likewise, false signals are going to be coming, complicating your analysis. We compromised the whole thing for the worst hostage rescue mission in modern Israeli history.
Yeah. Yes, indeed. I mean, many would say that, yeah, well, we've known that the United States cannot be trusted in this way, and the U.S.'s support for Israel is so, I guess, to use their terms, ironclad in the most horrific of ways. But the ways in which this was carried out, and how now, and I think this particular iteration of Israel's onslaught on Palestine has exposed for so many more people to see. I mean, the way in which both the U.S. and Israel are going to lose so big in the court of public relations and public sentiment is just immeasurable. But I wanted to ask you one more thing on this topic, Scott. You mentioned earlier the UN Security Council. It did just approve the U.S. Submitted resolution, which has this three-step process leading to reconstruction, first prisoner exchange, then a long-standing ceasefire, then reconstruction of Gaza. It's unclear how Israel is going to react to this, although I think history as a judge would say perhaps not well. But at the same time, this is indicative of, I think, a trend that you speak of in terms of Israel's overall situation being very unfavorable. And the fact, and one of the things that we didn't mention yet is the reason why there was so much bloodshed is because Al-Qassam, the Palestinian resistance, caught Israel and the United States conducting a so-called rescue operation that really was armed to the teeth to be a military operation, and hence massive fighting, massive casualties. So could you speak on, one, we have a Patreon member question who says, what happens if Israel violates this UN resolution? Because now it has been passed, Russia abstained, but the rest of the Security Council said, okay, let's go for this ceasefire. What happens if Israel decides not to go along with it? And how do you see this ceasefire, this recent ceasefire proposal within the larger framework of how this genocide, this war is going?
Let me just throw in, I hate to do this, Dan, but my brain works in weird ways. And I don't like to leave any useful analogy unreferenced. You said that the Israelis got caught going in, and that led to this broader battlefield. That does somewhat alter the proportionality debate. It's still disproportional use of force, but it's not as though the Israelis said that this is automatically going to happen when the raid takes place. What happened is, as you said, the initial assault force came in, was detected by Al-Qassam. Fact is, there's a lot of reason to believe that these hostages weren't held by Hamas at all. These were held by the PFLP. And so, somebody caught them. The major firefight took place, which required then the Israelis to launch strikes to suppress the fire, and the civilians got in the way. And I can just hear people say, my God, those Israelis are so cruel and inhumane and all. Are people familiar with Desert One, Operation Eagle Claw? It was an American aborted plan to rescue 50 some odd American hostages held by Iran at the U.S. embassy in Tehran. There was also a smaller element of Americans held at the foreign ministry annex. Delta Force, together with a team from Special Forces Detachment in Berlin, were going to launch an assault to free the hostages. But do people understand that the assault was going to be supported by an AC-130 gunship flying circles over Tehran? AC-130 gunship has 105 millimeter cannon, 40 millimeter cannons, 20 millimeter cannons. And if the mission had been compromised, because the idea is that they would seize the hostages, take them to a soccer stadium, and then helicopters would fly them out to an airfield that had been seized by U.S. Army Rangers, and C-141 transports would fly in, load the hostages on, then everybody would leave. The helicopters would fly out to the airfield, and everybody would leave. We'd blow up the helicopters, et cetera, et cetera. And if we got compromised, if the crowd in Tehran started to move, the job of the AC-130 was to lay down a wall of steel to prevent anybody getting near that stadium. And this meant that we could have killed, had we been called upon to do this, thousands, if not tens of thousands of Iranians. We would also have American aircraft flying in, ready to drop bombs and other things. We could have, had this operation gone forward, been in a situation where in order to rescue 53 Americans, we would have killed tens of thousands of Iranians. That is literally the definition of disproportional response. But the American response would be, we had a right to get the hostages, and we also have a right to protect our force once we begin carrying out this operation. And so, we have to, I don't like to be fair to the Israelis, because I really don't think they deserve fairness in this in regard, but we just have to be responsible when we talk about this particular operation and not be hypocritical. It would be hypocritical of me to sit there and throw darts at the Israelis without acknowledging the fact that had America's hostage rescue operation in Iran gone forward, there was a real chance that we would have killed thousands, if not tens of thousands, of Iranians in the process. So that's that. Now let's get back to your question. Sorry, I had to get that off my conscience, because I don't like to be hypocritical. I like to be balanced. Where does this leave Israel? Israel is in a very difficult situation right now, and the Israelis know it. There's panic in Israel as we speak. In order for Israel, the nation, to exist, it needs to be literally a land of plenty, a land of comfort, a land of economic success. And to have that, Israel has to live in peace and harmony with its neighbors, and to be horizontally and vertically integrated with its neighbors from an economic standpoint. This was on October 6th. Everybody was talking about normalization of relations. Israel was negotiating normalization of relations with Saudi Arabia. Joe Biden had just gone to the G20 summit in India, where he bragged about what he called the India-Middle East Economic Corridor, which would connect India with Dubai, and Dubai with Saudi Arabia by rail through Jordan, into Israel through Haifa, into Greece, so that India and Europe are now connected by this corridor. And this is such a big deal that Benjamin Netanyahu himself briefed this during the General Assembly debate in September. Instead of putting up his cartoon figure of the Iranian bomb, he put up a map that showed, Israel's role in this. And this is what Israel needed to survive as a nation state: peace and prosperity. Israel will never again enjoy peace, ever. They're not going to defeat Hamas. Gaza is a permanent wound. It's not going to be resolved in Israel's favor. Israel is talking about expanding the conflict into southern Lebanon against Hezbollah. Israel cannot win that conflict. I think one of the reasons why Israel hasn't yet launched that invasion is because they were reminded of that fact by Hezbollah, who successfully took out several Iron Dome sites in the vicinity, letting the Israelis know that they can take out all of the Iron Dome sites, and Israel will have no ability to protect itself from tens of thousands of rockets that'll land on Israel, fired from Hezbollah on a daily basis. And if you hit Israel with enough rockets over enough period of time, Israel doesn't exist. And the other thing is that Hezbollah isn't going to fight a fight that allows Israel to put 50,000 troops into southern Lebanon to push Hezbollah back to the Litani River. Hezbollah has gone underground, just like Hamas did in Gaza. And while Israel is digging and fighting Hezbollah there, Hezbollah will appear in the rear of Israel and take Galilee, take the northern. Hezbollah ensure that the next fight between Israel and Hezbollah isn't going to be fought amongst southern Lebanese villages, but amongst the villages and towns of northern Israel. And Hezbollah will win this fight. Israel now knows this. The Houthi have shown that Israel's sea lines of communications are vulnerable and have been successfully interdicted. And Israel has suffered billions of dollars of economic loss as a result. And then the continued attacks from Gaza, from Yemen, from Hezbollah, from Iraq now. The pro-Iranian Shia militias are now firing drones and cruise missiles that are striking Haifa, the city of Haifa. The bottom line is Israel will never know peace as long as it continues this current stance. The India-Middle East Economic Corridor is finished. It is not going to be revived. The concept of normalization of relations between Israel and its neighbors is ridiculous. Israel has lost the support it enjoyed amongst other nations around the world. In fact, the only nation that unabashedly supports Israel is the United States. Everybody else is turning their back on Israel. Israel has lost the world, which means that if this is not rectified, and it won't be rectified, that millions of Israelis are going to start asking themselves the question, can we continue to live in Israel? Is it the quality of life that we were expecting? Is this a healthy enough economy? Do I want to subject my family to the economic pressures and the psychological pressures of living in a besieged Israeli state? And the answer is no. Millions of Israelis have dual citizenship. They hold second passports. And we've already seen hundreds of thousands of them flee Israel. And if this situation deteriorates, you'll see millions more. And as Israel depopulates, it becomes less and less viable as a nation state, especially in terms of the singular state. Israel's in big trouble. The only thing that's holding Israel up right now is the support of the United States. The United States just passed a resolution now that's been voted in favor of by the Security Council. If Israel disregards this, they're going to lose the United States. The United States will have no choice but to move forward and impose some sort of restrictions on Israel. And we can make the following observation. Throughout the modern history of Israel, especially since the 6-Day War in 1967, no Israeli prime minister has been able to remain in power without the support of the United States. And no American president has been able to be elected without the support of the state of Israel. We have a situation now where Joe Biden is probably going to be compelled to decisively act against the state of Israel. And this is going to create tremendous political problems for him here in the United States. And we have a problem for Benjamin Netanyahu that he is going to have to act in a manner which alienates him from the United States at a time when his government is in collapse. And there may be the necessity for re-election, and this is going to damage him politically. So this is a big deal, this resolution. It puts both the United States and Israel, both Biden and Bibi, in a lot of hot water, which only then comes back to the point I was making. None of this promotes stability and peace. All of this promotes continued chaos and anarchy. And this will be disruptive to the region, disruptive to Israel, and probably prompt even more Israelis to flee. I don't see Israel lasting the decade. I don't see Israel as it currently exists surviving another 10 years. It can't. Its economy will collapse. And it's the political isolation will be real. And as you move forward with a two-state solution, that only works if both states are viable. But as Israel depopulates, and remember, if Israel is compelled to move towards a two-state solution, there's going to be big problems. There's going to be a lot of Israelis that say, we don't want to live in a two-state solution. They'll leave. The other thing is you have a whole bunch of West Bank settlers in there who have stolen land that they're going to have to be evicted. That is another guaranteed outcome from this. The settlers cannot be allowed to remain in any construct that is Palestinian land. If the Israelis move against those West Bank settlers, there's going to be a crisis of confidence inside Israel. Again, those settlers aren't going to say, okay, we're just going to stay in Israel. These are Brooklyn Jews who fled the United States knowing they were going to steal land and stay there. These are people who don't believe in hard work. They don't believe in earning anything. They're thieves. They're thugs. They're murderers. They're bandits. And when they lose their settlements, they're going to go back to where they came from, the United States or Australia or Canada or Europe. They're not staying. Israel is going to depopulate and lose its most fervent, Zionistic elements, which means that the Israelis that stay behind are going to be those Israelis who are conditioned to the understanding that Israel has to live peacefully with their Palestinian neighbors, which means that the Zionist entity, this Zionist experiment, is finished, and that whatever emerges from this isn't going to be called the State of Israel. It's going to be called the State of Palestine. And hopefully it will incorporate a significant Jewish population, of course, a significant Muslim population, a significant Christian population, Druze population. The current population of Palestine is going to have to come together and learn to live together. I had an interesting question from somebody the other day who talked about maybe the Irish could provide some sort of guidance based upon the Northern Ireland, compromises that have been made in terms of governance between Catholics and Protestants. And I thought that was a genius idea. So who knows what the future holds, but none of this bodes well for this entity known as Israel today, this Zionist state. The future does not look bright for them at all.
Yeah. And, when you mentioned the United States possibly, turning on Israel, or at least placing pressure on Israel to comply with something like this UN Security Council resolution, I immediately hearkened to this, to this video clip, this interview, or a brief press report that Antony Blinken gave now in Egypt, and I just want to show what he said,
and of course,
and have you react to it.
Israel.
Oops, sorry about that, because and then we can finish up here, because I think it goes to show that there's a lot of, I think, very impassioned and quote unquote ironclad still support. The United States, I definitely agree, is feeling the pressure to bring this thing, or at least the iteration that we're in, this brutal genocide, to a particular kind of close. But even so, here's what Antony Blinken had to say when just after this horrific military operation called Rescue Operation happened. This is what he said when he landed in Egypt.
And of course, what separates Israel, the United States, and other democracies when it comes to incredibly difficult situations like this is our respect for international law and, as appropriate, the laws of war. So we know that Israel will take all of the precautions that it can, just as we would. And again, that's what separates us from Hamas. And of course,
that's what separates the United States and Israel from Hamas. Final word, Scott.
I loved what he said. And as appropriate, the laws of war.
As appropriate, yes.
I know that when I was going through my officer training, that and we received extensive training on the law of war. That the judge advocate who was up there schooling us never once said, and as appropriate, the laws of war. He said the laws of war are absolute, baby, and you will go to hell if you violate them. I mean, that was drilled into our mind, the absolute imperative of Marine Corps leadership to ensure that the men and women that we're entrusted to lead into harm's way never allow the emotion of war to get the better of them, never allow revenge and to allow the death of your fellow Marine to turn you into a maniacal killer of innocent civilians. There wasn't as appropriate. No, it was absolute because the law of war is absolute. So Blinken gave away the farm there. That's one of the more dumb things that he could say. But the fact is, I mean, here we have the International Court of Justice, the court mandated by the United Nations Charter, calling what Israel is doing genocide. And we have a raid that appears at face value to have violated critical, critical elements of proportionality when it comes to this, the legal question of can you use humanitarian, aid as a front for carrying out a military operation? Is that a violation? You're not allowed to launch attacks from hospitals. So should you be allowed to launch attacks from a pier that was built for the purpose of delivering humanitarian goods? There's a whole bunch of questions here, but Blinken, is just lying through his teeth. Israel has not been operating in conformity with international humanitarian law, with the law of war. Israel is a gross violator of international law, and the United States, in facilitating Israel's action, is likewise a gross violator. So, with all due respect to the Secretary of State, he's just dead wrong on this. But again, what do you expect from a Biden administration, which has provided blind support virtually for the crimes committed by Israel against the citizens of Gaza?
Indeed. Well, I think we can leave it there, Scott. It was great to have you on. Before we go, be sure to, of course, hit that like button, subscribe if you're new to the channel. You can go to the video description and find scottritter.com to follow all of what Scott is doing. You can also find all the ways to support this channel in the video description. Tomorrow, in less than 12 hours now, I will be on with Pepe Escobar from Moscow. It's very sad that you were not able to be there with him, Scott.
They sent me photographs. I have to tell you, the pain.
The worst. I bet.
Larry Johnson and Jackson Hinkle, they're all sitting there arm in arm, cigars in their mouth, whole drink. I don't smoke cigars, but hell, I would have put one in my mouth too to take a photograph with those guys. But it's painful because it's just like you're looking at it going, ah. But I'm glad he went. I'm glad they were able to experience it, and I look forward to his appearance on your show tomorrow.
Yeah, you will be going. I'm sure there will be another SPIEF in your future, Scott. You can find that link now in the I'll put it in the video description right before we go here. Also, you can find it in the chat now. And what else? You can find it on YouTube because it is public on YouTube. So right after you leave this stream, you can just go over there, hit the notifications icon, so you know that in about 11.5 hours, we will be live again. But with all that said, it means we do have to head out of here and get some rest, Scott. It was really good to have you back on again. ScottRitterExtra.com to support Scott in waging peace and all those efforts. And then, of course, video description for all the other ways to support the channel. All right, everyone. Bye-bye. And Scott, any last word before we head out?
September 28th.
Yes.
Million person gathering in Kingston, New York. Mark it on your calendar. Be there.
We'll do a lot of promotion on this channel around that, have a lot of conversations, and probably sometime in July to begin, as this channel takes a little bit of a hiatus after tomorrow. But all right, we are out of here, and we'll definitely see you all again soon. Bye-bye.